Well, it's raining today, so today's a good day to stay indoors and make a video. Now, being from Liverpool, I said I was going to talk a little bit about Liverpool, and I often watch people who've made films on Liverpool on the internet. It's great, the internet is much better than watching television because you can watch whatever you want. And some people put some very interesting stuff, and I'm learning about the city of Liverpool all the time, because you assume that because you're from there you know everything, and you don't. Not at all. I learned more things since I've been away than when I was there, for sure. Including pictures, old pictures, archive pictures from back in the day. Now, I've mentioned it before, if you look back in some of my, if you've been following me for a while, you'll see in some of my older videos, I did mention that my mother's side of the family were from Scotland, which is true, absolutely true. Although her parents, my grandparents, were actually born in Liverpool, because their parents had come down to Liverpool in the Victorian days. They were from Scotland, but my grandparents were born in Liverpool. My mother was born in Liverpool, but they're all of Scottish descent.
The name did originate from it being called lobscouse, which is like the Scandinavian name. But it's a fairly simple dish with basically potatoes, carrots, we use turnip in ours, onion, and then there's the seasoning, whether it be salt, pepper. We use a bit of tomato puree in ours, and I think the secret to it is cooking it over a long period of time, and that's where it gets all its flavours from. So it's traditionally served, it's either with beetroot or red cabbage. A lot of people, and when we used to as a family, well, as my mum and dad used to do, we always used to cook ours with mince, but my mum would do it in a pressure cooker, and she'd cook like whole onions with hers. And we'd have that like as a starter, like a big chunk of a big onion with a big lob of like butter on there, salt and pepper, and we used that as a starter. It's a family business. Well, I've run it with my sister Carly, and mum and dad's had the place for 18 years now. It seems we're fairly well established on the street. It's so popular, in fact, that we've tried for like the past 10 years to try and get it in a marketable pouch or in a tin, which we originally tried to do. But now we're successful enough in order to put it into Tesco's, and it's that popular that people are now buying it in Tesco's and soon to be in Asda and other supermarkets. So long may it rain.
Now, I found this documentary yesterday that this lady made. Her name's Amy Clarke, and I'll put a link to her channel below. And she made a brilliant documentary. I was watching it, and she made it with a digital SLR in 2013, and she got some brilliant shots in there and some amazing stuff that even I didn't know, So I'll give her a big shout out there for her channel. I did contact her, and she did give me permission to reproduce parts of her documentary. But if you want to see the full documentary, I'll put the link to it below, and strongly recommend going and taking a look, because Liverpool is a very interesting place. I know my grandparents talking about things and stuff like the overhead railway. They had the first electric overhead railway in the world, apparently, and it was brilliant. Everybody loved it, everybody, and it ran down the dock road, right the way down all the docks, because it's a long way, the dock road, back in the day. And for some reason they just demolished it, and everyone was devastated. They said it should never have been demolished. They really wanted to keep that, and I think the truth was it got damaged in the bombs during the war, and it got patched up, but it was only like a temporary repair, and it really needed a lot of money spending on it to fix it, and it's a great shame that it's not there still. It's a great shame.
Apart from people from foreign countries coming in here with a totally foreign language, the local dialect of Liverpool was, until the 19th century, basically flat nasal Lancashire. It actually begins in about the 1830s with the arrival of the Scots, but they came here in large numbers, and they brought their rolling, guttural, back of the throat emphasis, their accent, the Scots accent, which began to affect local dialect. Their "see you, Jimmy" became our "you're right there, la." That's where all that comes from the Scots. Of course, in the 1840s, we do have the Irish, who speak as if they're dancing a jig or a reel. There's a banter in the way that the Irish speak. There's a toing and a froing. The Irish are incredibly bright people, and they have a very sharp wit. And Liverpudlians are known for their wit, their use of language, their play on words. We get that from the Irish. They also enjoy this verbal sparring that is so fundamental in the Scouse psyche as well as the dialect. We get that from the Irish. From the Scots, by the way, we get our solidity, our reliability, our strength of character. That affects the Scouse personality too. Then the 1850s, 1860s, the final Celts come in, the Welsh, with their very musical type of speech. Have you ever noticed when you talk to a Welshman that everything he says always ends on an upbeat, like this? Always very positive, musical. That's where we get our ability to sing, play music, write music. They're very spiritual, the Welsh. That musicality in the dialect came to us, which is why every Scouse phrase, again, ends in an upbeat.
So when you start talking about a city like Liverpool, I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's fair to say that the city made a lot of money from the slave trade, which is true. Can't deny it. It did, and a lot of that money is reflected in the city, in the buildings, and you see today. And you can see it was a very rich city at one time, the port, but also there was a lot of poverty because the people that came from Scotland, they were cleared out of their homes for one reason or another, sheep farming, and came down to Liverpool in the, I think it was the 1840s, somewhere around there. They didn't have any money, they were all skint and they were all living in slums, you know, and the poverty in Liverpool was terrible. And the potato famine, people were starving to death in Ireland, and they came across to Liverpool. So they're all mixed bag of people, all different people. Chinese, there's a big Chinatown in Liverpool, and you've got Indian, you've got African communities in there. So everyone just sort of grew up together and just got on with it. You got loads of Catholics, you got loads of Protestants in there, and two cathedrals. Liverpool's got two cathedrals. One's Catholic and one is Anglican. And the Anglican cathedral, although it looks like it's centuries old, it isn't. They built it in the 20th century. I think they started building it around the time of the First World War, and it took them about 100 years to finish it, I think, something like that.
And the first slave ship to come into Liverpool actually came in 1699. It was called the Liverpool Merchant. And in 1710 they built Liverpool's very first wet dock. That opened in 1715. The trade increased so much after that period that by 1750 Liverpool had overtaken both London and Bristol as the main slave trading port of Britain.
What we have now is, if you imagine a graph going along from the first years, 1207 onwards, and it's coming along pretty slowly, and then all of a sudden it just goes off the scale.
Yeah, the slavery triangle, they call it. It begins really with three places: Britain, the west coast of Africa, and the Americas, usually the West Indies, the Caribbean, that sort of area in the 18th century. A Liverpool merchant would equip a ship with a crew. They would load it full of European goods, manufactured goods, things that weren't available in Africa: guns, alcohol, steel weapons, things like this. They were then shipped down to the west coast of Africa, where these goods were used to exchange for slaves that had been captured during war. So it was a sort of exchange system, really. We provided manufactured goods to the African tribes, they provided the slaves to the Liverpool slave owners. The slaves were then crammed onto these horrific ships. Quite often they didn't have room to move. There's stories of extra decks being put in with only 2 or 3 feet gap between decks, so the slaves could lie down, they could pack in as many as possible. Then they would sail across the Atlantic to the colonies in the West Indies and the Caribbean, and those slaves that survived the terrible journey would be put into work in the plantations of sugar and tobacco, which were the 2 biggest crops of slavery in the 18th century.
The only slaves we had here were the personal property of local merchants. They would have been house slaves, houseboys, coachmen, chambermaids, and there were a number of those here. But we had a black population of independent, free black people going right the way back to the 18th century, and it's important to say that. Every black person was not a slave. These were craftsmen, artisans, poets, musicians, skilled people who came to Liverpool as everybody else did to make a new life for themselves. Chinese came here in vast numbers. They started coming here in 1866. Chinatown, with Chinese architecture. We have Chinese dragons everywhere. The local community centre is known as the Pagoda. And of course, the largest Chinese arch outside mainland China at the entrance gateway, if you like now, to Chinatown at Nelson Street. But every nationality on the planet, I think one can safely say, is represented here in Liverpool.
And as in the Second World War, Liverpool was a very strategically important place because this is where all the ships were coming, bringing supplies from America, because we didn't get anything from Europe, obviously, because the Germans had occupied Europe. So all the food, everything had to come on ships in the convoys from the United States and Canada, and they all came into Liverpool. The whole operation was based in Liverpool, and they were seeing that as an Achilles heel. And I think that was Churchill's only worry really during the war, was the U-boat menace to the convoys. He saw that as a serious threat. If they could cut that off, we'd be finished. So that's another reason Liverpool was bombed a lot by the Luftwaffe, did a lot of damage to the city. To this day there's a church. I remember a church through my childhood. Every time we went to town there was a church that was all boarded up because it had been burned out during the war. And it's a war memorial, it's a monument today. It's still there, all burned out, but I think they've cleaned it up now and you can go and look at it and ponder it. But in my day when I was there, it was all, you couldn't go near it, it was all boarded up. Danger, keep out signs everywhere. And I think they've even twinned it with Cologne in Germany, which was another city that was heavily bombed during the Second World War. Now it's also true to say that the first ever railway in the world was in Liverpool. It was from a place called the Rocket. It's still called the Rocket, and it was Stephenson's Rocket, which was like a kettle on wheels, and it pulled a few carriages and it went down the track to Manchester and back, and that was the first ever railway. The railway's still there, although now it runs all the way into town, into the city centre. But the Rocket is still there. There was a pub, I don't know if the pub's still there, the pub called the Rocket. The whole area was called the Rocket after the Rocket, Stephenson's Rocket, the first steam engine in the world. It's quite a history, isn't it? So a lot of these people in the Victorian days who'd arrived in Liverpool from Scotland and from Ireland and from Wales, a lot of them stayed and a lot of them didn't. A lot of them got on the boats and they went off to colonise North America. Liverpool was a major departure point for people going to North America, what's now the United States of America. So yeah, there's a lot of people in America have got ancestors from Liverpool, without a doubt. Liverpool's got a very famous football team. If you're into football, the Beatles came from Liverpool. And you know, there's a lot of other things, of course. But I'm just trying to put a general. This is Liverpool. Now there used to be a maternity hospital in between the two cathedrals. It was called Oxford Street Maternity Hospital, and I think it's gone now. It's been demolished. But I was born there in 1961. So I used to pull other people's legs and say, well, you're a plastic scouser, because I'm a true scouser. I was born between the two cathedrals, but it doesn't really make any difference, does it? And we grew up in Chilwell, in near the Abbey pub, All Saints Church. Used to live there. Well Lane. Used to live on the side of the hill there. As you come from the river in Liverpool, there's a slight hill that goes up to not very high. And it runs from the north to the south down to Speke, and as it goes over the top, you've got Chilwell. That's the posh people, where the posh people live. And we weren't posh, but we used to live. The rich people live on the top of the hill, and as you go down the other side, that's where we lived, where All Saints Church was. And then at the bottom of the hill, you go under the railway, and that was all the council estate, but it was all still Chilwell. So people say, oh, we're from Chilwell, and it got to be dead posh. He said, no, we weren't from the posh bit, we were sort of halfway between the council estates and the posh bit. So that's where I grew up. It was alright, it had its moments, its ups and downs. But both my parents were born in Liverpool. They lived just off Prescott Road, a place called Longview. And so my parents grew up on the same estate pretty much, and I think my mother was from Moorcroft Road and my dad was from Hazel Road, so it's the same estate. That, you know, they met, got married, bought a house, and that was the one in Well Lane. My dad had been an officer in the Royal Air Force. He'd been off to Canada, to Prince Edward Island, to train to be a navigator. And when I was growing up, he'd left the Air Force and he'd become a member of the RAF VR, that's the voluntary reserve, and they looked after air cadets. And my dad was the commanding officer of 90 Squadron Air Training Corps, which was based at Speke Airport in those days. They had a wooden hut. It was just the back of Garston Gasworks. And yeah, I used to go down there, and I desperately wanted to be old enough to join the Air Cadets. I think you had to be 13 or 12, something like that. And I just wasn't old enough. I got in there in the end though, that's for sure. I really enjoyed the Air Cadets, it was great fun. My dad later became a wing staff officer. He got promoted to squadron leader, and so someone else took over his squadron. And our wing staff officer was in charge of about 7 squadrons, so he had to go around checking up on like 7 squadrons in the wing, and then there'd be a wing commander above him, so they'd have like 3 squadron leaders or something like that, I can't remember. But that's obviously where I got my interest in aeroplanes, because the 90 Squadron Air Cadets was on Speke Airport, and they had an air show every year, with the Red Arrows and the Rothmans display team and other aircraft, and I loved it. Absolutely fantastic, couldn't get enough of it. I had all the Airfix models of everything.